Although I've covered quite a few nuclear technologies over the past few years, there is one which I haven't touched upon, but is regarded as one of the most insidious forms of nuclear weapon. One which was parodied by the Mad magazine with the slogan, "Save buildings, not lives," and on the one hand was called the cleanest nuclear device by its creator, whilst being seen as one of the most inhumane nuclear devices, namely the neutron bomb. When its proposed deployment was leaked in June 1977 by Walter Pincus of the Washington Post, it created a worldwide outcry that the American Carter administration were about to deploy them without a major public announcement. So what is a neutron bomb, and why did it cause so much controversy at the time, when despite the talk by the military that it was a much needed weapon, it was never actually deployed, and by 2003 all US stocks had been destroyed? Well, the neutron bomb is still another form of nuclear weapon or atomic bomb, but to give it its correct title, it's an enhanced radiation weapon or ERW. It was created in the 1950s by one of the members of the Manhattan Project, Samuel T. Cohen, after he visited the Korean War and seeing the similarity between Seoul and Tokyo. He had also seen the devastation created by the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and in his mind he decided to create what he called the most sane and moral weapon ever devised. A weapon that would avoid the total devastation and long-lasting effects of radiation that the atomic bomb had shown, and yet would still provide the ultimate purpose of war, basically to kill enemy soldiers in the field. In 1958, Cohen had been investigating a low-yield clean nuclear weapon, one which would create a large burst of radiation but without creating a very large amount of long-lasting radioactive fallout as seen in conventional atomic bombs. He discovered that the bomb case thickness made a major difference to the amount of radioactive fallout that would occur. This was because the case of a nuclear weapon, which was often made from depleted uranium, and was used to reflect neutrons from the nuclear reaction back into the bomb's core to increase its reactivity many times. This was also the source of most of the radioactive fallout. He figured that if you used a thinner case material, most of the high energy neutrons would escape. This would create a much lower yield weapon with less destructive capability, but it would release 10 to 15 times more neutron output compared to a conventional nuclear weapon. Neutron bombs were unique in the fact that the radiation radius would extend beyond the blast radius of the weapon. Even the biggest bomb, the 50 megaton Tsar bomber, had a neutron range which was smaller than its blast radius. He calculated that a 1 kiloton bomb could release more lethal prompt neutron radiation than a much larger conventional non-ERW device. He justified this use of radiation to kill soldiers because it would have a relatively small blast radius and do much less damage to the surrounding infrastructure and buildings, as well as being more humane than using many conventional weapons such as thermobaric bombs, napalm and cluster munitions. Although he was convinced in his ideas that this would be an ideal and manageable nuclear weapon that could be used as a tactical device on the battlefield, 6 presidents came and went before he could convince President Jimmy Carter that this would be a weapon to counter the overwhelming tank superiority of the Soviet Union, which by the mid-1970s was deemed to be up to a 4-to-1 advantage compared to NATO in the European theatre. The problem which NATO had in the 60s and 70s was that the Soviet Union had created a huge conventional army with many more tanks and armoured vehicles. The fear was that a Soviet attack would send huge amounts of tanks into West Germany in tight formations, making them much more difficult to counter than if they were spread out. Cohen convinced Carter that this small ERW could be used to intimidate the Soviet Union into widening their tank attacks and thus making them more vulnerable to conventional weapons like NATO tanks, which were seen to be superior, and the anti-tank missiles which NATO had in the hundreds of thousands. If that didn't work and the conflict was going against NATO, these weapons could be used on NATO soil with less blast damage and residual fallout than a conventional nuclear bomb, and that they would be small enough that they might not trigger a full-scale nuclear retaliation from the Soviets. The idea was that they would be detonated above the massed ranks of Soviet armour, and that the intense burst of radiation would produce an almost instant incapacitation of the crews inside any unprepared armoured vehicles and troops on the ground within about a 1 kilometre range. This was seen as a deterrent that would minimise civilian casualties, as it would be restricted to military targets and kept away from civilian areas. But of course, this was still a nuclear device, and although it was much smaller than the one dropped on Hiroshima, 1 kiloton compared to 15 kilotons, it still produced a blast radius of about 500 metres. And because it had much less radioactive fallout, Cohen said that it was a clean weapon that would leave the area it had been detonated over able to be used within days or less by what was hoped to be NATO troops. But the idea of using a tactical nuclear weapon against the much larger numbers of conventional armour of the Soviets was seen by many in the Western military and political leadership of the West as being one of the triggers that could bring about an all-out nuclear war. One that had to be avoided as much as possible unless there was no other alternatives. The use of these enhanced radiation weapons was put into practice in the late 50s and 60s, though, as part of anti-ballistic missile systems used by both the US and the Soviets. Here, high-speed anti-ballistic missiles such as the Sprint missile would be fired into the path of an incoming ICBM and detonated within about 100 metres of it. The high-energy neutron burst given off by this would cause a partial fission of the incoming warhead, with the hope of effectively disabling the weapon. Approximately 120 of these neutron bomb-armed missiles were built, and about 70 entered service from 1975 to 76 as part of the Safeguard anti-ballistic missile program, until it was eventually shut down and decommissioned in the early 1980s as part of the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT. The Soviets also used this type of device as the last layer of their anti-ballistic missile defense over Moscow to protect it against a Western attack. But how clean and humane were the claims of Cohen about the neutron bombs? The primary method of destruction was an intense burst of neutron radiation, which would be effective against any organic materials, basically anything that was alive within the radiation radius. Atoms are made up of positively charged protons, negatively charged electrons, and neutrons which carry no charge. When a fission reaction occurs in materials like uranium-235 or plutonium-239, these large unstable atoms split apart when they're hit by a neutron. This causes new isotopes to be created and a lot of energy in the form of heat, gamma and X-rays, and the release of 2 to 3 more neutrons, which can then go on to hit more uranium and plutonium atoms in an exponential chain reaction, which only stops when the material itself is blown apart by the heat of a reaction. The neutrons released are fast or prompt neutrons, usually in the 13 to 14 megaelectron-volt range. This means that when they hit protons in atoms of living cells, especially hydrogen atoms in water and fat cells, they can recoil a proton forward at high speeds. And because the proton is a charged particle, it dumps its energy very densely, causing intense ionization paths within the cell. This causes complex DNA damage, like breaking it up into smaller strands and leaving clustered lesions. It also damages cell structures and membranes and causes cell death or the loss of function. This high-energy neutron radiation can also create secondary radiation, which gives off gamma rays and other energetic particles, which could go on to create even more damage within cells. There is also another effect caused by neutron radiation, which is called neutron activation. This is where neutron radiation induces radioactivity into other non-radioactive materials when their atomic nuclei capture the free neutrons, becoming heavier and entering an excited state which is unstable. This nucleus then starts to decay immediately by emitting gamma rays and particles such as alpha, beta and fission products. Basically what this means is that within the neutron radius, other materials, especially metals, but also including air, water, soil and the elements in it, can be made radioactive. Normally these have short half-lives ranging from 7.3 seconds for nitrogen-16, which is found in air and water, to 14.96 hours for sodium-24 in concrete and soil salts, but up to 5.27 years for cobalt-60 in steels and alloys. All of these would add extra radioactivity into the area. Although it's said that death would be instant for those close to the detonation, with radiation levels of up to 8 Gray, for reference 1 to 2 Gray is usually fatal but not always instant. If they were further away, the dose would be still lethal, but the effects of acute radiation syndrome could take days or weeks before death finally occurred, as the body can no longer replace its damaged cells. Basically a slow, painful and very inhumane end. If you've ever seen the dramatised TV series Chernobyl, then you've seen the effects this has. Now this was under ideal conditions. However, in the real world, things are different. The Soviets knew that these weapons could be used, and it doesn't actually take much to add protection to mitigate for most of the extra neutron radiation. The air itself provides absorption of neutrons. This is why the range is only about 1 kilometre. Beyond that, it drops off rapidly. Also, armoured vehicles can be fitted with extra materials with high hydrogen content, such as water, plastics, polyethylene or boron carbide, boronated steel or wax. This could drop the neutron level within the vehicles to where it was no longer capable of incapacitating the crew. Then there is the issue that if such an attack were to occur, there will be thousands of vehicles, and they would only have to be spread out a bit more, and you would need hundreds of neutron bombs covering approximately 1 square kilometre each to mount an effective defence. Even though they had a much smaller blast radius and fallout levels, detonating dozens or hundreds of neutron bombs in a relatively small area will probably be worse than using conventional nuclear weapons. And as it would be used on home soil, any collateral damage would be against German civilians, not Soviet ones. But the most obvious thing was that any form of tactical nuclear weapon, be that conventional or ERW, would more than likely trigger a corresponding response from the Soviets, and before you know where you are, you're into a full-scale nuclear war. Although Jimmy Carter's administration said they would adopt the neutron bomb, they actually put it on hold and didn't build any. It would be Ronald Reagan's administration which actually built them and put them into production, with approximately 700 ERW devices in the 1980s, in the form of the W-70 Mod 3 Lance missile and the W-79 Mod 0 8-inch artillery shell. However, due to the extreme political pressure from Europe where these devices would ultimately be used, they were not deployed and instead stockpiled in the United States. But during the mid-70s to late 80s, superior high-precision conventional anti-tank weaponry like the A-10 Warthog and advanced anti-tank missiles made neutron weapons obsolete by the 1990s. The last W-70 warheads for the Lance missiles were dismantled in 1996, and the W-79 artillery shells were fully disposed of by 2003. Other countries also developed ERW weapons, including France and China, but both again only developed and tested them. They didn't deploy them. Instead, they saw them as a technology reserve that could be called up if required at some point in the future. The Soviets did make their own versions, and after the fall of the USSR, its successor, Russia, in the 1990s and 2000s, worked with the US to destroy approximately 25,000 weapons. But due to the fractured nature of the breakup of the Soviet Union, it's not known if the now Russian ERW weapons were destroyed. But if they did survive and hadn't been maintained, it's unlikely that they would still work. So I hope you enjoyed the video and you found it interesting, and if you did, then please thumbs up, share and subscribe, and a big thank you goes out to all of our patrons for their ongoing support.